we go. All right. Good evening, everyone. This is Kim Hallin, and welcome to the second edition of Horse Wisdom for Humanity. This is a video discussion series that I've launched in kind of preparation for a book that I have coming out in February 2022. And this is right now the webinar series is sort of a prelude to that, and we're just going to introduce some of the topics. And then after the book is published, this discussion series will morph into a place where I bring small groups together for deeper discussion about some of the topics that are introduced in the book. And so I have some of the same women with me tonight who are here for episode 1, and I have a couple of other new people who are joining tonight. I'm going to introduce them in just a second. But what we talked about in episode 1 was the meaning of life, or the right to life, from the perspective of horse wisdom Horse Wisdom for Humanity. And tonight we're going to be talking about liberty or freedom from the perspective of Horse Wisdom for Humanity. And then the third one is going to be the pursuit of happiness. So it's basically a breakdown of the American ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and how we can get a different perspective on that by looking at it from the perspective of horse wisdom, which essentially for me is like a conduit to the natural world and a more nature-based look at this versus just our own human perspectives on it, and the same thought processes that we get stuck in over and over again about these themes, and how can we step aside from all of that and just look at it differently. So tonight we're going to be talking about liberty and freedom. And who I have with me tonight, Peggy Norwood Stella was here last time. She's with me again. And Peggy is an exercise physiologist and creator of a new BMI, which is Body Mind Intelligence. So Peggy, if you'll just say hi for a second so everyone can see your face.
Hi there.
Great.
Good to be here.
Awesome. All right. And then we also have Caroline Miller, who was here last time too. And Caroline is a certified Alexander Technique teacher and owner of a business called The Harmonious Horse and Rider. So Caroline, will you say hi? I think you have to say it out loud. There you go. Yeah, you have to speak for it to come to you. Perfect.
Okay.
And then I also have tonight, right now, Nancy Munoz is here, and she is the co-founder of a nonprofit called Free Horse Arts, which customizes integrative arts education and equine experiential learning for people of diverse abilities. And Nancy and I collaborate a lot between Unbridled and Free Horse Arts. So Nancy, will you say hi?
Hi, everyone.
All right. I may have one or two other people who join us before we get to the discussion part, but I just wanted everyone who was visiting, watching this back later to know who's here with us. And I can't wait to hear these ladies add to the discussion for tonight. So as I said last time, what I do when I talk about, downloading the wisdom of the horses, like what does that mean? And it just, for me, means essentially that I go out into the pasture with the horses, I get into their space, I get into their energy, I try to clear my mind, and I take whatever topic it is that I want to understand a little more clearly or that I'm struggling with, and I ask for them to help the wisdom of the natural world drop in for me so that I can see things from a different perspective. And so usually the first step of that, almost always when I sit with them, is they say, let's first let go of everything about this topic that is purely human. Right. And so when I sat with the concept of liberty or freedom, and I asked the horses to help me just weed out everything that's purely human, what came to me that needed to be weeded out of that idea of freedom was captivity. The horses were telling me, were helping me remember that the experience of living in captivity, whether it's temporary or permanent, is a condition that humans alone created and that we perpetuate. So if you take humans off the planet, captivity doesn't exist anymore. At least not that I could think of anywhere in nature does the way that we think of captivity exist. So that was really quite profound for me. And I just sat with that for a little while. And then the question that came into my mind then was, in a world where captivity doesn't exist, does freedom still exist? Because to me, freedom and captivity are opposites, right? And whenever I think of opposites, like let's take light and dark. Light and dark are opposites. Um, if you take light away, all that exists is darkness, right? There may be all different kinds of very varied levels of lightness or darkness, but if you take light away, all that's left is darkness. And if you take dark away, all that's left is light. So opposites typically, if you take one away, the other doesn't exist. When I think about wet and dry also, those are two opposites. If you have wet and dry and you take wet away, all you have is dry. So wet has no meaning. If you take dry away, then you just have wetness, and dryness has no meaning because wetness is all that exists. So I started sitting with this of like, if we take captivity away, is all we're left with freedom? And that didn't seem as easy to me as like light and dark or wet and dry. I was like, is everything else freedom? Not the way we think about freedom necessarily. And that's where the horses sort of dropped in and were like, yeah, we don't really have the same definition of freedom that you do. Now, we have a lot of definitions of freedom, and I think that's part of the problem. If the only definition of freedom is that you're not held captive, then yes, those are opposites. Freedom and captivity are opposites. But there are lots of ways to define freedom, and we attach a lot of meanings to them. Here in America, specifically with the First Amendment, we attach freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and the right to petition the government. Those are from the First Amendment. It's a lot of different aspects of freedom, none of which have anything really to do with captivity, right? And we also think about, we like to have freedom of choice. It's gotten to a point now really that we often say we want to have the freedom to do or say or be whatever we want, right? And is that really freedom? Or I've heard some people say that's actually anarchy. And so this I was sitting with too. I was like, is that freedom, or would that result in anarchy? Anarchy being like freedom from the government or freedom from those kinds of controls. That can look and feel more like a state of disorder or chaos than what our ideal vision of freedom is. I don't think when most of us think about freedom that we're thinking about chaos or disorder being what we're striving for. So when you think about a herd of wild horses, this helped me too. I always like say, okay, let me think about it in horse terms to see if I can separate myself from all of our human, conditioning and thinking. And when I think of a herd of wild horses, there's actually a lot of order and organization and balance in their experience of living free, wild horses, right? It's definitely not chaos. It's definitely not disorder, but yet they don't have any kind of government or those sorts of rules organizing it or controlling it. So here's a bit of the wisdom that came in. The reasons that we humans believe that a state of no government or no society or workplace, no government, no society or workplace or family, even if we're in that kind of community, any of those kinds of structured communities, and we don't have formal lines of authority, our fear, I think, is that it would become chaos, right? It's hard for us to imagine having any kind of society or organization or workplace or even a family that didn't have kind of a structured organization to it, that it wouldn't work. That's, I think, what a lot of our core belief is in most humans, and anyway, have some fear about that. But if you look at a horse herd and you look at other kinds of animals too, it's not just horses. There's a lot of order to the societies and that these communal animals have. And there's a lot of order to just the way the whole natural world works, the whole cycle of sustainable life. And so I think it's this fear that we're going to digress into chaos that keeps us clinging to artificial forms of control, right? So that we don't fall into what we fear of chaos. The bottom line is that the natural world actually cannot exist in a state of chaos or anarchy. Life would not survive, right? The whole world, all species, the whole cycle, none of it would survive if it was chaos. And we would not be able to survive in that state either. So I'm looking at my notes here. If all the human domesticated means of maintaining order were removed, if we didn't have them anymore, we would eventually be forced to fall into or in line with the natural balance of the larger world around us, because we couldn't survive if we didn't. Now, that may not make sense immediately, so I'm going to break that down a little bit more. But that's what came to me was we think that we need to have these things to create order and structure and maybe even a sense of freedom. Like we need to be American to have freedom. Sometimes we believe that, right? That we need to be in this country to have freedoms, or we need to be in any kind of community, a structured society in the human world. So that got me thinking again, like what would a horse say that freedom is? If it's not freedom from, government, because that doesn't exist in the natural world either. What I got coming in from the horses is that true freedom, in terms of how the natural world would see freedom, is having the ability to express one's species-specific innate evolutionary drives and to use our life experience to fulfill our species' purpose and place in the natural cycle of sustainable life. So that can be something that's really challenging as a human to think about, because we've become so conditioned by many, many generations now, right? That we don't even know what the natural evolution, like primal state of humanness is, like early Homo sapiens. There are no feral humans anymore. Let me put it that way, right? We can look at, there are thankfully still some feral horses and horse herds that we can look at those communities and say, how do they live in their more natural state? There are no, that I'm aware of, that we can study totally feral human societies anymore, or feral human groups. So we're so separated from that it's really hard for us to even imagine like what is our place in the cycle of sustainable life. Where are we supposed to be if we're in balance and in alignment with the natural world? So this was a lot to sit with and try to sort out. And it kind of was scary to me, because it's like, if we don't know, if we don't have a way to look at what does a feral, wild, free human look like and act like and behave like, how are we ever going to find our way back to it, right? And I even sat with it in the question within myself of like, how does my own innate evolutionary beingness want to live? And I couldn't really answer it. Like, it's really hard to figure out where we would be. And that felt pretty overwhelming. But what I got from the horses with that, as I really sat with it, was that how horses organize themselves naturally, right? And how they cope with the challenges and limitations in their own environments. So freedom to horses, or freedom to wild animals, does not mean that there are no limitations or challenges, right? Wild horses have limitations dictated by the weather, by the environment that they live in, by the terrain that they live in, by the predators that live in their area. So it's not that horses are free to do whatever they want, right? They have limitations and challenges in their living, even when they are free. But what really came in for me was that how they organize themselves and how they decide how they want to live as free beings is based on the consequences of the choices they make. They can make any choices they want, but their choices have consequences. And those consequences, individually and collectively, are what guide how they choose to live and how they have evolved to be able to survive, right? So those things are all intertwined. But it's not that there's no order. It's not that it's chaos or anarchy. It's that their choices have consequences, and they're smart. Horses are smart. All animals are smart. Humans are smart too. We would organize ourselves based on the consequences of our choices too. One of the things I think that humanity has gotten caught up in is we don't really like to have consequences for our choices. And that is often, I think, why we think that freedom is not having consequences. And that was the really heavy thing that came in, was that consequences are what allow us to live in a way that we have freedom and we still have order. Consequences. So this was a big thing, and I sat with that for quite a while. In order to truly be free, we can't necessarily have control of our own consequences. Consequences happen because we can't control others. We can't control the weather. We can't control the way the predators behave. We can't control how another individual behaves. So our actions have consequences, and then we adjust our behavior based on those consequences. And this is part of the cycle and the balance of life. So our love affair with being in control of others, which we do love to do in human society, and everything outside of ourselves. Like, we get really frustrated when we can't control the weather. We talked about that in episode 1. You know, we feel like when hurricanes come in or earthquakes, you know, how dare Mother Nature destroy what we've built, right? We feel like we've somehow been wronged when there's consequences to decisions that we make and things that we do. So in the horse world, in a horse herd, what happens is that every individual in the herd is taught and encouraged, and it's modeled for them from an early age, how to be responsible for their own choices and how to understand that every choice we make has consequences. And it's not really, for us, I think that the challenge is to not think about freedom as having power or being in control or being able to do whatever we want without consequences. That we can think more about order and balance will naturally ensue if we trust the balance of my behavior causes other behaviors, and eventually there's consequences. So it's kind of this whole cycle and balance. But one of the things I wanted to that was more not that dropped in as like wisdom from the horses, but something that I've observed in my horses, which I also balance into kind of coming up with the horse wisdom for humanity. Whenever my horses or my neighbor's horses get loose, they do not run for freedom the way that like a human slave or a human prisoner would run for freedom. Like, oh my gosh, I'm free. I'm out of here. I'm going to get where they can't find me and I can't be caught again. That's not what horses do. When horses escape, it's not usually, and I'm not saying never, it depends on the situation they're in, but say my horses, for example, it's not that they're actually like running away from the experience of living in captivity so much as mine will run or trot or walk casually, whatever, towards something that they suddenly have access to that they didn't have access to before. You know, maybe it's a better grazing area, like grass that they can't usually get to, or the horses across the street. They definitely very drawn to other horses, right? And that is, they're drawn to the things that are their innate species specific behaviors, grazing and exploration, getting familiar with their territory, which in the wild is much bigger than like my enclosed property. So it makes sense that they want to get to know these parts of the environment that they can see from my fenced enclosures, but they can't explore them. So when they get loose, they can explore those. They can eat grasses that they can't eat when they're inside my pasture. They can go visit the horses next door and create a larger herd community, which is what horses will do in the wild. They're very communal. They're safer when they're in larger communities of horses. They may organize into family bands, but they want to be part of a herd of hundreds of horses. So they're going to join up. They're going to go try to meet and get to know the other horses in the area. But they're not running away. I live on a dead end road with a curve. My horses get loose. They're scared to go around that curve. Like they don't go very far. They're not trying to run away in the sense that I don't want to be caught again and be held captive. They don't have that thought at all. And if I bring one back, the others are going to naturally follow. They're going to come back on their own voluntarily because they don't want to be separated from the safety of their herd, which is again part of what's innate about them, about feeling free and feeling alive, is they can choose to be with the horses that they have relationships with. And that's how they want to live. That's how they evolve to live. So it's these innate drives in them that will take precedence over what we would think of as freedom. And there's a lot of fear. I find I used to get very afraid when my horses would get loose that they were going to run away. I would never find them again, right? They were going to get too far away. And it was really from stepping back and watching what was actually happening. And they weren't really trying to run away, that not in the way that we think about it. And after they had kind of explored what they were going to explore, they're probably going to come back to their familiar territory anyway, most likely. At least my situation here. It's all different, but again, horses don't go out running away, trying to hide, trying not to be caught again, just because they've gotten free from being in the enclosures. And I think this is why when horses are allowed to live more naturally, even within a domestic setting, they're much healthier. They have a lot less anxiety and stress. I can oftentimes open the gates on my property and the horses don't even leave. They're more likely to want to escape, say if they're kept in a stall and they're not able to move around and graze and do the things that they evolved to do and that they want to do innately. They're going to be more likely to be like, yes, oh my gosh, I'm out of here, right? It's not, again, this idea of running away from captivity so much as it is running toward wanting to be able to live the way that they evolved to live, that their species innately wants to live. All right. Just about to start opening this up to see what we can play with here. But a couple things that, like, when I tried to start going to, like, what is innate, what does it look like if humans get to have the freedom to play out what is our actual evolutionary role as a species, as part of the cycle of life? If we aligned with that versus trying to separate ourselves from nature, which we talked about last time, that the purpose, the meaning and purpose of life is being in alignment with this natural cycle of sustainable life. And we've kind of lost touch with that being the larger purpose for all living beings. And so some things that came to my mind is it seems pretty obvious that, like horses, humans are communal, right? So I have a feeling that if we were given the freedom to live according to our innate, like what our species wants to do, I think we would be communal. There's no evidence, and our early ancestors, there's evidence that they were communal to some extent, maybe nomadic, maybe not communal exactly like we are now, but humans didn't really evolve to live isolated, independent lives. Obviously, we have the ability to be creative problem solvers. We've used that in all kinds of ways, but as we talked about last time, what if we put that creative problem solving ability, if we focused it on trying to align and be in balance with the natural cycles of things? What if we put our creative problem solving to work toward that, rather than to separate ourselves from the natural world? We also have language and dexterity, and you use tools. So again, these are things that our species evolved to be able to do. But having abilities is one thing. How or why we use them is another thing. So let's look at horses again for an example. Horses have the ability to jump, to cut cows, to pull carts, to do dressage, to carry riders. They obviously have the athletic ability to do all these things. But feral horses in the wild don't naturally do any of those things. It would never occur to them to do any of those things. But we've taught them how to do it. We can train them how to do it. What have we trained ourselves to do that we maybe think is just innate in us, but maybe it's actually been taught, or we've learned it, or we've been conditioned to do it, and it isn't necessarily because we have the ability to do it, doesn't mean that if we were living in alignment with the natural order of things and the natural world and our role in the sustainable cycle of life, we might choose to use our abilities differently. We have that ability too. We have free will. So this part got kind of interesting to me. It's like, we could choose like an entirely different path and use our innate abilities. And would we feel, if we used our innate abilities differently, would we feel more free? Would we not have all this struggle of always feeling like our freedoms are being infringed upon? So that's kind of where I left it for now. I really kind of want to hear some of your thoughts, or what about this strikes you? What's interesting? What makes no sense? What seems really off? Punch holes in it. I don't care. Like, this isn't about right or wrong. This is me sharing what came to me when I sat in the pasture with the horses. And then I'd love to play with it more with you guys. Help me flesh it out. Like, we're the humans. I'm looking to the horses for answers about what's our natural role. And what I'm getting from them is like, we're way off. Like, we're thinking about it, in ways that are not in line with nature. So anyway, let's just stop there and say, who wants to, anybody have something you want to say just in response to any of that? Okay, Peggy, go for it.
I'll go. Because one of the things that came to me as you were speaking that I was thinking about, because you prefaced that this being sort of an American viewpoint, because you're talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And it seems to me that there's very much, I don't know how to put it, but like individualism is a really, really important attribute, I think, in the American culture. And I think even the rebellion in 1776. I mean, look, these independence, right? Declaration of Independence, and that became sort of, it's like as the individual. And I think that this has now, I think that when we are talking about the freedom as an individual, that's where I think the waters gets a little murky. And so I was like, how do I say this? But it just feels like that when we're talking about the natural world, that freedom, as you said, is within the context of the herd, for example, with the horses. The freedom is within the context of the community and the recognition that there's that connection, so that it's not necessarily the individual, the expression, the freedom of the expression of the individual, but rather the freedom to make the choices within the bounds of the community, if that is making sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I definitely think you've hit on it. And I think Nancy and I have talked about this before. When I watch horses, they obviously have individual identities, right? And horses are also a little bit different than us in that it's very hard for one horse to physically control another horse. Like, they can't put pressure on each other, but they can't grab another horse and put it over here, right? So there's a little less of control, and there's not necessarily a set hierarchy. They work that out. They work out a lot of stuff amongst themselves. But yes, I don't know that horses have this individual identity that we have that is separate from being part of the community. I don't think they feel whole when they're not part of the community. And I don't know, do you think that's true of humans too? We like this ideal of individualism. Nancy, you go ahead. Yeah, but what would a person really feel like if they were by themselves? Go ahead, Nancy.
That happens often in meditative settings. You've heard of the yogi climbing up in the Himalayas and staying in the cave, and the whole concept of 40 days out in the desert. I mean, there are analogies to that throughout traditions. And as humans, I think we have to be really careful to draw the inspiration and the inquiry that you're bringing up relative to the horses, without necessarily concluding, for instance, that freedom is in the context of the community, because then there's a great danger of herd mentality going awry. There's a great danger of being so confined by one's community that one doesn't answer the question that you asked earlier, which is a really potent question. You know, how does my own innate beingness want to live? So those are the kind of questions that horses may not ask, but horses, the beauty of what you're doing, Kim, is horses brought you to ask that question.
Right.
So I don't think it has to be, you know, I don't think we have to confine ourselves to living within the context of a herd when that herd is inspiring questions that frankly grow beyond the confines of our herd. And the innate human specific questions you asked earlier, there are some real low base, dangerous, innate human specific behavior that none of us would want to perpetuate, I'm sure.
Well,
so
and I think that's where, again, community can be the community of life, right? So even that person who's up in the mountains in the Himalayas, they're not alone, right? There is, yeah, so there's a question of how communal would humans live, but also we need to remember that we are part of the community of life, and that our behaviors and actions do affect others. So these base behaviors that we say are bad, I don't know, I'm curious about in a less formally structured community, again, would there be consequences? All right, Caroline's waving her hand. Caroline really wants to speak. Go ahead, Caroline.
I'm finished, but I'm dying to say something.
Yeah, go.
I was like, don't finish this till I say something, because it feels like the whole world, the whole, I see it differently than the concept of community. I see it more as oneness,
Okay.
because with horses, their herd and their community is much more a community and herd of oneness. They're all equal in the sense that, yes, okay, there might be, I mean, and even the leaders change, you know, I mean, they don't see each other as one being richer or poorer, or, you know, having more or having less. They don't see any of that, the comparison. So nobody has control over anybody. But when we think about, if we, you know, to me, the only way that we'll ever, I don't think we'll ever solve the problems, but get somewhere is realizing that we're all the same and that we're all one. Because when you have the hierarchy of someone always controlling other people, I don't know, I'm really struggling with how to say this, but it's what I'm seeing is, as long as there's the power struggle, there's fear. And whenever there's fear, then we can't ever get to liberty, to bring it back to liberty, because, you know, it's like we think of liberty as being free of, I think of liberty, one of the definitions for me might be free of fear. And because I think of liberty as a mental construct as well. And one of the things, going back to what we were talking about last week, that ties into this, to me, this part of this discussion, is that nature, once again, is bringing us to a place, is having a role in bringing us to some sort of equanimity, because even people who are very, very, it's equal, it's the great equalizer. You know, COVID, everybody in the world knows what COVID is now. So it's having this communal effect. And you were talking about the greater community, you know, the community mind thing. So it's, I don't know if any of this makes any sense, but it's really racking around in my head. Yeah. So I'm trying to get the words out in some way that makes sense. But it's like, even someone like, you know, Jeff Bezos or whatever, people that aren't affected by things that are normal fears for most people, until something like COVID or some huge disaster, you know, world disaster, that environmental thing happens that actually affects them and creates fear in them. So, you know, fear becomes our great equalizer in a way too, because then you're the same as everybody else. So I don't know if that makes any sense.
I think
Mhm.
what comes to me when you're saying that, the big fears, I think absolutely are equalizers. One of the problems that has come to me in several of the times that I've sat with the horses is that humans, we fear ourselves, right? We fear one another. We don't fear very much about, we don't have natural predators really anymore, right? We protect ourselves from illness. We have medicines. I mean, we are not living in the same world that the natural world is in a lot of ways. We have created this false world that, I don't know, like a lot of the fears that we have are not fears that would mean anything to the rest of the natural world. And
even worse, Kim, the fears are of the natural world. So our natural predator now has become that which you are talking about supposedly being in alignment with.
Yes. And that takes me right back to last time, which we got to also was, our relationship with death. And I don't think so. We have to go back to what we came up with in the life one. Humans do not have a natural relationship with death. We don't have a healthy relationship with death. Death is part of the cycle of life. We shouldn't be afraid of it. It should be a sacred process. We should understand that the death of other things feed our life. Our death feeds the cycle of life. Like that, once we separated from that, it's very hard to, we don't say we have freedom from death, but boy, we try, right? Like a lot of us live our whole lives trying to avoid illness or injury or death specifically, or postpone death or avoid death. And, that's just a mindset that's purely human as well. And I think holds us captive in lots of ways. So.
But let's just, if you're recording this, I'm just thinking about the individuals who are contemplating suicide. So there's a tremendous, there's a tremendous issue right now with humanity being on the precipice and a lot of people choosing suicide. So that I just wanted to bring that up just because the context, again, much of what you're talking about has many sides to it, and underlying all of it is the paradox beyond all of it. So obviously the opposite of being afraid of death, namely embracing it, one has to kind of put that in context too.
Well, and so again, let's go back, because we all start to get sort of wrapped up in it. And I'll go back to what the first thing the horses always tell me is, let's take everything human off of it. All right. I don't know the answer. Does suicide exist in the natural world among animals, among other things? There are some stories that make you think possibly. There are sometimes when animals or self-sacrifice, that there have been instances where that might happen. How much of it is judgment we put on that act? Then there's also all of the stressors that we have now that lead people to choices that, because of just the despair they feel in the way that we're living now, there would probably be, I would think, there's less of that in the natural world. I don't think I ever noticed birds or squirrels seeming to take their own lives out of despair. I can't say it doesn't happen. I don't observe anything that I see looks like that. I think we also talked can't remember if we talked about this last time, of, humans also, we have this really big obsession with privacy. And freedom and privacy are kind of tied together a lot of times. We sort of think there isn't much privacy in the natural world. Most things happen in the open, or at least maybe not in everybody's eyesight, but there aren't so many opportunities. A lot of the things that have become human, I want to call them dysfunctional or displaced behaviors, are because our love affair with privacy creates a lot of opportunities for things to happen that the community doesn't know about, that aren't in the public eye. Obviously, there's some benefits to privacy, but we have to be honest with ourselves, I think, about the opportunities that the way we live with lots of privacy creates. There are a lot of things that don't happen in horse communities because the horse community won't allow it, right? A lot of times really rogue behavior in a healthy herd. Our domestic herds are not always healthy herds, so it's hard to see there. Anyway, that's kind of another, I'm sort of getting on a lot of different topics here, but it's that challenge of separating what is purely human so that we can look at what natural is, and then look at what does it look like if humanity intentionally tries to align more with the natural ways versus, again, our world is so different. Yeah, what comes up for you guys with some of that? Freedom in a world where there's no captivity and there's little privacy and no country lines, state lines, property lines. Ownership is a whole nother thing that gets into this. It's only human created. Ownership does not exist in the way that we think of it in the natural world. It's hard to get your head around.
There's so many applications of these questions. So more than anything, I'm just grateful that you're asking the questions. And I think it's really helpful for people to sit with it, whether they are able to sit with it with horses as their guides, or just within their own intuition. These questions, I think, are really helpful. And I'm not sure if you pose them in this way in your book, or if you, in your blogs or whatever, if you just allow people to consider, how does my own innate beingness want to live? Or, how are we trained in ways that may not be in alignment? I mean, in the horse world, let me count the ways.
Right.
But beyond the horse world, in the political arena, there are infinite examples of the need for consequences, especially these days, especially as the next election cycle.
Yeah.
There's so many ways that these questions are extraordinarily helpful.
Thank you for that. And yeah, they are. So some of these, I have different chapters on many of these: freedom, privacy, trust. So I'm going to be posing these questions along with some stories and other things to dive deeper. But yeah, this series was really kind of a challenge to myself to say, as I said at the beginning of the first one, I find myself getting frustrated with these ideals that seem so beautiful: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and the way that those get used for all kinds of different purposes and agendas that maybe are in alignment with what our founders wanted or not. But also it even makes me question if, we were already, as humanity was already so far off track, that even those ideals, maybe those are faulty ideals. Maybe aligning with the balance, being part of our ability to create sustainable or maintain sustainable life on Earth. As we talked about last time, Earth's going to go on, right? Humanity may or may not last very long. The Earth will rejuvenate and life will go on, and the energy of life will just take different forms. But if we're smart as a species, I think we want to try to figure out what are the ideals we want to strive for so that we can be part of the sustainable cycle of life. And we have to align with nature. Like, obviously, it's clear now, it's clear in humanity's path, we're not going to win against nature in the end. We need to be with it, right? We need to somehow realign with it. And what I get from the horses is that's we got to this at the end of last time too. We get really focused in the human world on fixing what we think we've broken or what we blame each other for breaking. We're always, some of us think we're on the right side of issues. Some of us, we think the other people are other people with other beliefs are on the other side of the issues. And I'm not sure that there's so much right and wrong as it is balance and imbalance, and that there will be an ultimate rebalancing. And we either contribute to that or we don't. But so the freedom to choose to align with the natural way, to shed the things. So again, rather than fixing, I think it may be more about just shedding so much of what we've come to believe and think, because the answers are pretty simple. Everything else, everything that's living aside from humans, the answers seem a lot more simple. And maybe it's just about letting go of all the stuff we've been churning on instead of fixing it. Peggy, you've been quiet.
Oh, look, I've been rolling over this whole idea about human and nature. And it just brings up far more questions for me. But as I'm thinking about what is human and what is nature, right? Like, you're even, when you sit within the herd and the horses ask you separate out that which is, right, that which is human. And yet we know, and even as we're talking, that humans are a part of we're all connected. We can't really separate it all out. But what is it about us, if we're looking for what is our true nature, like being naturally human, and what that means? Then again, this just opens up all new questions for me. But I think it came, like, as we were talking, I kept thinking, but how can we separate the fact that we are indeed human beings from the whole? We can't just pull out and say, oh, well, we're human, we got to be like not human. We are. So how do we we still have to embrace our humanity, but somehow find out what is that connection with, and we come back to that word connection. What is that connection with the natural world that we can pursue and follow, and would bring us into that space of not separate, right? I think that again, it's a sort of sounds like a highly complex thing, and yet it isn't.
Oh, and last time we got back to, what did we say? Align, balance, connection were words that kept coming up, right? Alignment, balance, and connection in the natural world. And so maybe it's partly the question of, like, what does it mean to be human? And what does alignment, balance, and connection look like for humans in the context of the larger world?
That's right.
I think it's like, we can't just think about it though in the connection of ourselves and our own society. Like, I think that's part of the problem, is we consider ourselves sort of just living this whole separate existence from the natural world. So what would those qualities, rather of happiness, we said we wanted to go with alignment, balance, and connection. Not saying those are the answers. I'm just saying those are words that we've come to several times, you and I discussing, and then also last time. And what would that look like? So what would that look like? But when I say separate from the humanness, I think it's more, obviously, no, not being not humans, but separating from these concepts and ways of thinking.
Right.
We've been trained to think about it in a certain way, right? Or the things that are, again, like religion, philosophy, politics, you know, a lot of those human constructs,
Yeah.
our financial systems, the things that only exist in the human world. That for me, sometimes it helps me find clarity, and the horses have helped me find clarity by separating out from those systems that we've created and trying to look at it separate from those. Because it gets really, really complicated.
Yes.
Those are added back in. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let me ask a whole different question. This is maybe personal, or think about it for yourself, or if you want to try to think about it as a species. But what, gosh, if you felt like the thing I feel most important to have my freedom to, what makes me feel free, or what does my essence, what do I need for my essence to feel like it's free? That's a whole different question, but what would you answers to that? It's hard to answer.
I think what comes up for me, right, something came up right away, and I don't know if it's the thing, but I would like to be free from the constructs of my historical programming. You know, my ancestral programming and what came before me, and really I think by really looking at what is coming through me that's not really me, it's not really who I am, but is so ingrained in me from my ancestry, I guess, from or historically, and so taking some of the historical constructs out of the picture.
When you talk of those, are you thinking of human ancestry?
I'm thinking of both, but yes. I mean, if we thought of as a species, if we still weren't so attached to survival and living in our lower chakras, because we're always still so fear and flight oriented. And if we could if we could get rid of, there's so much of that has historically been part of us that I think we're so programmed by it. And so freedom would be, there's something to me that just pops up about being able to change the programming, the past programming. So, and that's the same as saying change the perspective, I suppose, but, you know, but really maybe learning about and seeing what that programming, how that programming affects me as an individual anyway. But I'm listening to some other people right now that are posing very large questions like you are too. And one of them is kind of bringing that piece up about how programmed we are as a culture and society and species at this point, from, you know, where we've come from, and that how that's affecting us now, and that until we come to some sort of mass shift in perspective of that we really aren't that anymore, don't need to be that anymore, and see things differently. So there's freedom from past. I mean, I don't know quite how to, freedom from some piece of what I genetically came in with in some way, you know, or that we all, you know, because of the history before us and our ancestors, and we can't help it. It's not, you know, but to look at the world without all those blinkers on, you know, although I think of horses terms blinkers, but you know, to see that without all of that baggage that I have brought with me would be very liberating.
That's very interesting. And I don't know that I'm thinking about it in the exact same way that you are, but you know, humans have humans have a lot of history of, terrorizing ourselves, right? Terrorizing our own species. And I'm not saying that there's never fear or fighting or danger among same animals of the same species, but, we certainly are quite unique in the types of, what made me think about that is your thing about the living in the flight or fight. Sometimes some of the things I've gotten from the horses too are that it's actually not super healthy for us to live in some aspect of that, right? That's sort of how nature stays in balance. That's part of that consequence and order thing, is that I even saw a show recently that was talking about the role that predators play in, keeping environments healthy, and that how differently some of the grazing animals behave, and even where they graze, where they live when there aren't the right balance of predators, right? Because they feel safer to be in those areas. So now they're infringing on the grazing areas that another species is supposed to be on. So it's like everything has consequences. And we've sort of lost that natural balance of having consequences. But rather than being the consequences being outside of our species, primarily, our consequences are typically within intra-species.
But to just support Caroline in her inquiry, go for it, Caroline. Keep excavating, because the river of blood is something that can carry you downstream, or it can be something that you can kind of rest on the banks and just watch the river go. And my answer to your question, Kim, relative to what is it that would necessitate freedom for me, would be conscious awareness. And so Caroline resting on the bank so she's not swept continuously downstream by ancestral consequences and choices that have been made long before her. And now the beauty of this moment for all of us, even though it's a really precarious one, is we can start doing this work. We can start making these conscious choices and support others in doing the same. And hopefully having a good time and playing and, all of the rest of it. But again, my encouragement to you, Kim, for encouraging people to not only learn the ABCs, but can you imagine what this culture would be like if instead of teaching the ABCs the way we usually do in school, we completely transformed the meaning of ABCs to alignment, balance, and connection.
That's what Peggy's all about too, in the course. Yeah,
I like the sound of that.
But and Caroline, I love hearing that you're engaged with some others who are having these conversations, because we need to be approaching these questions from lots of different angles and different perspectives. But we certainly are at a pivotal time, I think, where we have a big choice. As we talked about last time, I think humanity now realizes how much imbalance we've created, whether our ancestors understood that now or not. I think we do now. So the question is, can we use our higher intelligence, whatever, to again, what I really liked last time, where we said, let's take away the need to fix and realize that we can also still have solutions. We don't have to fix the old in order to find solutions. Like, there are solutions that are right in front of us, that are there, that might take a lot of brain twisting to figure out how do we switch over to starting to align with that. but yeah, we all need to be trying to find ways. And for some of us who love horses, getting out in nature, sitting with the horses, contemplating these things, rather than just training and riding and enjoying those things with horses. Like if they can help us, anything that can help us connect with, I don't know, finding freedom, a different definition of freedom. I do think there's a lot of problems with our definition of freedom. And that was certainly what I was getting. And this is sort of a personal reflection, but the question of, I love Nancy's answer of conscious, hello, conscious awareness is what makes you feel free. And Caroline saying freedom from this ancestral baggage. But I think a lot of us don't necessarily know how to answer that question. I still have trouble answering that question for sure, what I think my human soul wants or needs in order to feel free. And it reminds me a lot of, having been in, I've been in an unhealthy marriage where there was a lot of controllingness, right? And you get conditioned to not being in touch with your own innate desires or wants or needs. And when I got free of that, I had a really hard time. I didn't know what I wanted. I didn't even know sometimes what I wanted to eat for lunch. Like I could get that out of tune with what my soul or my body or whatever wants. And so I think it's hugely beneficial just to sit with that question, as Nancy said, sit with that question of what does our soul, our human soul, not necessarily our individual person, Peggy, although there's that too. But I think I think there's like two layers to the question. Like I think we do sort of have to figure out though, as humans, like I could look at horses and wild horses and animals in the wild, and you can kind of start to piece together what some of the things that they evolved, how, because they are behaving more in their just evolved innate behaviors. And it's more complicated for us. There's so many layers that aren't just our innate evolved behaviors as Homo sapiens. But if we could remember what those are, it might help us, right? It might help us find center again if we could remember what those are. So if you guys think about early Homo sapiens, what do you think, even just from what we know from science, what are some of the things that our species evolved to, how do we survive? What is the role we play in this cycle of life?
I would encourage us to go beyond early Homo sapiens.
Okay, so go on with that. What do you mean?
Well, what's the timing like?
Oh, we're okay. We still got like 20 minutes.
Well, I think there's also limitation in pointing to what we currently might be conscious of the evolutionary scale, because I think that's part of the shackles that we need to untrain ourselves to, and the educational belief systems. I don't necessarily want to hypothesize about the different levels of existence, the different civilizations that have existed, and what might even exist now on multiple levels. I think everyone has to, again, ask themselves that question. But there's lots of evidence emerging about what we think is the human experience being well beyond the classic Darwinian evolutionary scale.
Yeah, because that's part of this human construct, right? that whole scale, all of those theories, all of that has been, I appreciate that, Nancy. Yeah, I think we have to think beyond all of that.
And if we do it for, I just want to stir the pot a little more. If we do it for ourselves, we've got to do it for our horses. I don't know about y'all, but I have been around horses that are not, are maybe atypical beings. They look like horses. They act sometimes like horses. They smell like horses. They eat like horses, but I suspect they're not just horses.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. So I'm going to bring it back to one more little kind of question that sits with me in my little way my mind works, which is, where in our history, our evolution, our history as humans, where did this motivation to separate ourselves from nature, is that an innate thing? Is that something we learned? Is it a choice we made in all the choice trees? And then once we made that choice, we just kept going down that road. Could we have made a different, but I don't know, like that one sits with me, is like, where did that happen? Where did that, and why did that happen? Why did that happen? Anybody have thoughts?
I can't even, I don't know what the name of the philosopher that separated out humanity and nature, and the natural world. I don't remember. There's some philosopher I know that at some point was made the determination that the humans were above like nature, and there was the separation that came into it. But I think that by placing ourselves separate, became a very convenient platform upon which a lot of I don't know, governments or capitalism or slavery, or to place ourselves outside of the natural world, then allow there to be so much in terms of hierarchy and the things that were done to promote just to promote humanity at the cost of nature. I do believe that what we are experiencing, and it's just becoming bigger and bigger and so evident, is that incredible imbalance that has created. I mean, it's like it just has blown it. It's like blown so far out of proportion by taking that idea that we have dominion and running with it. That's the balance that's going to have to be. I mean, that's the balance that has to be pursued.
Yeah,
is bringing it back, that we are not separate, that we
it's the original big lie, right?
right, exactly. It's like that's like there's so much connection, and everything we're talking about, the consequences. I mean, every action that we have there are consequences for that. And quite frankly, I think with much of the unease that we're looking at in the world today, it's just direct consequences of those actions that were built upon, right? A lie that we are separate, or that we are better, or that we have dominion, and it just that constructs has not worked.
Well, and what I came to, as just as you were talking about the consequences, this goes back to what we said last time, which is the rebalancing of that. Like, we are, perhaps, whether we realize it or not, we're still going to be living with our consequences. Like, we've created all this stuff that we're living with, but in the end, that of what creates order and balance is consequences to decisions and behaviors. Those consequences aren't always immediate. Some are. right? Some of the ones that govern day-to-day behavior in the natural world. But what we're going to be having, I think, are some delayed consequences that are really big
Mhm.
to our decision to live so separately from nature. Maybe it will all rebalance, you know. It will all rebalance.
Nature can do yeah, nature can do that. So
But
yeah,
but I guess the interesting question is, you know, can we choose to be part of the rebalancing
correction
versus just
or
waiting?
the rebalancing, yeah, as opposed
Yeah,
to correction. Yeah.
right. Versus just, you know, waiting for it to eventually happen. You know, the larger
Yeah.
natural world will take care of it. But in terms of us feeling free, like that won't feel free to
That
us,
doesn't
right?
feel
It'll again feel like this great consequence that is infringing on our. But would we feel differently if we were aligning to be part of the rebalancing? Yeah. Interesting. Very interesting. I think what I come back to most of all, though, is just that, you know, our love affair with freedom, it doesn't necessarily, I'm not gonna say it doesn't mean what we think it does, because it means whatever we think it means, but there's a lot of danger in the way we're thinking about freedom as humans. Yeah. I don't think everybody can ever feel free in the according to the definitions we have set for freedom. Obviously we don't.
And I think that as you brought up earlier, that the document, you know, the saying life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and when you think about the fact that it was written by slave owning white men, you know, who agreed that this was like, oh, and let's go, you know, this land is really, you know, available to all of us. I mean, just take care of the native, you know, the ones who were living there. I mean, there's so much out of balance about the way our country was founded.
Yeah.
I think it is going to take a conscious choice to rebalance that, because I think the intentions, while the words may be nice, and it was a rather, you know, revolutionary document and concept to form a democracy such as ours, we still have to say, well, you know, there's some flaws here, and make a conscious effort to say, well, what can we do? You know, how can we actively move to bring it back into balance? Because it was, yeah,
And
that is something.
I think that leads us back kind of where we landed last time, which was, you know, obviously thinking about rebalancing systems that are so out of balance, that feels really overwhelming, and none of us have the power alone to do it. But what we do have the power to do is to start thinking in our own minds, asking these questions, asking about what does better alignment with the natural cycle,
Mhm.
the natural balance of life mean for me in my life, and even thinking about what it could mean. You know, then it's like anything, once we shift our perspective, we start making different decisions, we start having different conversations, we start seeing things differently, and that's what will lead to change eventually. It's not like this, we're going to rebalance it right away. So I don't want it to be a feeling of like overwhelm, because it starts with our own mental and emotional shift. Like if we don't recognize that there's an imbalance that needs to get addressed, then we're not ever working. We're just trying to tweak things in a system that's so out of alignment, it's never going to be right anyway. Right.
Right.
Then we don't spend a lot of energy trying to tweak what becomes very clear that like that's faulty to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd rather spend my energy, you know, working on talking about and working toward things that feel like they're more in alignment with what we now see is really important.
And that feels like freedom.
And that feels like freedom.
That feels like freedom. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Interesting. That might be a good place to end, but Caroline or Nancy, do either of you have any final thoughts, reflections, ideas, words of encouragement?
I have to say, I there's way more to unpack from this conversation than my brain can really wrap around. I started out tired as it was, and now my brain is just ready to explode.
Yeah.
I'm just like, what? Oh my God. Oh, so much. Yeah, I'm having a hard time getting past the overwhelm
Hmm.
in this conversation, just because it feels so hopeless when you look at all these misalignments, let's put it that way. You know, it's like just it can be very frustrating, but it's been useful, and I'm sure that, you know, there's going to be little bits of it that are going to, my brain's going to unwrap as we move along here. And I don't know, right now it's like just overloaded.
You're sitting with
Totally
it.
full. Yeah.
I would just encourage you all to keep, one breath at a time. Just doing what you can in as consciously a way as possible. Caroline, it is not about any of that out there. Your work has already, you've got a lot of excavating already begun. So just the fact that, just know that you have people supporting you, loving you through this process, encouraging you through this process, already creates the kind of energy that will help in realignment for others, for each other and for others. So this kind of herd is a sacred thing.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. Thank
And
you. Yes.
the other thing that comes to me through that, thank you both for those honest and uplifting thoughts, even in the overwhelm, because it can feel overwhelming. But I think the other freedom is the freedom from being responsible for solving it, right? And none of us individually have any responsibility to solve it. I think I feel, the more I think about it, I feel like I have more responsibility not to contribute to it if I can, right? I mean, we're all part of systems that contribute to it, but in the places where I have an opportunity to maybe not. But the natural way is that no one species, no one individual carries the weight of that responsibility. That should be, it shouldn't be overwhelming. As we talked about last time, just by being alive, you are participating fully and in a very valuable ways to the cycle of life, right? And the balance and continuation of that energy. And I know you, and I know all the ways that you're contributing to it in beautiful ways. So thank you all for the ways that you contribute. Caroline, did you want to say something else?
Well, we were talking about last time and this time about realigning with nature. And it keeps coming to my mind that we need to realign with humanity as well.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. The soul of humanity, right?
Yeah. The collective humanity.
Yeah. Because I do believe, and I get from the horses that is a beautiful collective soul. They're not giving up on us. We're not giving up on ourselves. Again, they told me last time, we can't break it. We can't break everything. So we shouldn't feel solely responsible for it, but we can choose in our own ways to start aligning. And that does feel really nice
Mhm.
when we have those moments. So awesome. Thank you, ladies, so much for diving into these like crazy deep topics with me. And you've helped me also kind of flesh out all the different pieces that are intertwined with this idea of freedom. And that will help me some as I'm fleshing out the final parts of my book too. So thank you for that. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Good night.
Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thanks.